Welcome back to Palestine Bookshelf. I'm Stephen Heiner, and today we're going to be discussing Blood in the Water, How the US and Israel Conspired to Ambush the USS Liberty by Joan Mellen. This is the second book in our USS Liberty miniseries, and it's the third in a combination of books and documentaries. I would recommend, if you haven't seen my review on my previous review on the Liberty, which talks about how things happened, the book by James Scott, The Attack on the Liberty, or the Al-Jazeera documentary Film Club that I already did, I would recommend watching one of those in order to, or reading an account of the Liberty in order to better understand this review. This review is a why review. Both of those reviews, one being on a book and one on a documentary, are what's. What are the facts of the case? What happened to the Liberty? Once you've understood the facts, then you can start probing into the why. And this book very much is a why. And so what I'm going to cover today is going to go into intelligence questions and put forward different theories as to why this might have happened. So doesn't mean you can't just keep watching. If you don't want to hit pause and go watch those other reviews first, that's fine. You can watch this and then maybe go backwards. But I would just recommend it's better to have some sense of what actually happened, because I'm not going to be talking about that in this review. We're going to start with what is the idea of a false flag. If you're not familiar with that, it's something that has been used frequently in U.S. history. So to give you some kind of background, the best known example occurred at the turn of the 20th century when the Maine, sitting in Havana Harbor, was fired on, with Spain blamed, justifying the U.S. entrance into the Spanish-American War. The idea of a false flag operation, of firing on a ship and attributing the attack to another country, surfaced again in a 1962 document that Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had included in a list of covert actions. These were to be deployed to remove not Nasser, but Cuba's Fidel Castro. "We could blow up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba," Lemnitzer had written in his proposed Operation Northwoods. I'll put a link to Operation Northwoods in the description. He continued, "Casualty lists in U.S. newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation against Castro. Cuba would be destabilized, justifying a new invasion and a renewed effort to remove Castro. It was shades of Remember the Maine in Havana Harbor. Firing on one's own ship was a casus belli, a pretext for a war of aggression." So, what is a false flag? It's intentionally harming yourself in order to blame that on someone else and then to move into a war. So one of the U.S. intelligence officials who worked closely with the Israelis, who were trying to find a reason to topple Nasser, who was the strong pan-Arab leader, which had the threat of uniting the Arabs against the Israelis, Nasser had to go. A U.S. intelligence official replies, "Help us by giving us a good reason to come in on your side." He's speaking to the Israelis. "Get them to fire at something, a ship, for example." And this was some time before the Liberty attack, but we can see it germinating from the Americans. The Americans were the ones who gave the idea to the Israelis, not the other way around. The Israelis just started putting it together. How does this sit within the Israeli consciousness? In Ben Zvi's words are contained the seeds of the operation against the USS Liberty. And what did Ben Zvi say? This is Yitzhak Ben Zvi, who was president of Israel from 1952 to 1963, I think. "How wonderful it would be if the Egyptians started an offensive which we could defeat and follow with an invasion." In Ben Zvi's words are contained the seeds of the operation against the USS Liberty, a false flag operation blaming the Egyptians for an act of aggression that originated with Israel. Propaganda based on falsehoods would accompany this creation of pretext for the bombing of Cairo. Clues for this pattern abound in the public statements of Israel leaders. In 1955, Moshe Dayan, Israel's chief of staff of the armed forces, said, "In order to have young men go to the Negev, we have to cry out that it is in danger." A pattern of false flag operations begun in the 1950s would persist into 1967 and the Six-Day War. Arabs would be demonized as Israel found pretexts for its own aggressions. Israel would persistently raise the false flag that its very existence was in jeopardy. And that persists until the present day. Part of it was Egypt didn't go easily. History reveals that Egypt was difficult to provoke, time after time robbing Israel of sought-after pretexts for invading. About to leave the government in 1956, Sherritt had acknowledged that reprisal actions, which Israel could not carry out if tied to a security pact, was necessary to maintain a high level of tension among Israel's population and in the army. Without these actions, they would have ceased to be a combative people. Had they not cried out that the Negev was in danger, young men would not go there. The demonization of Egypt, attributing to Egypt his own expansionist agenda, remember, every accusation is a confession, had been articulated by Ben-Gurion. So, if I understand why this is happening, they need a reason to go to war, because they can't just attack everyone, otherwise they do look like mad dogs, which is what they're aspiring to. They need to have pretexts, they need to have reasons, not only to give an excuse to the United Nations, but they need to convince their own population. And listen to that, I need to maintain a high level of tension among Israel's population. And I suppose that's just indefinitely. The trauma that is going to be passed on to Israel's population by keeping them in a high state of alert, because there's always danger, because the Arabs are all going to come kill us for no reason whatsoever. It's not just, the false flag isn't just for the rest of the world. It's mostly for their own internal population. And Zionist writers would later term the Six-Day War a preemptive strike for the security of Dimona. We don't have time to talk about this too much in this review, but it's important to realize the Dimona nuclear facility, which was camouflaged as something else, Israel continually lied to the U.S. about the purpose of Dimona, and they managed to steal from a place in Pennsylvania using a front company to steal nuclear waste and then use that to build a nuclear facility and weapons from that. And it was all going on in Dimona. JFK questioned the Israelis about what was really going on in Dimona and whether they had nuclear weapons. The Israelis lied. And just by strange coincidence, JFK ends up dead. I'm sure there is absolutely no connection whatsoever between JFK not being happy about Israel's lying about having nuclear weapons and being unwilling to sign up to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Again, a discussion for another time. There is a body of opinion within the American intelligence community that James Angleton played a leading part in orchestrating the events leading up to the June 1967 war. One long-serving official at CIA's ancient rival, the code-breaking National Security Agency, states flatly that Jim Angleton and the Israelis spent a year cooking up the 67 war. Don't have time to get into James Angleton, but Joan Mellen spends about 100 pages on him in this 400 and something page book. It is useful because he's a major player here, but I think she could have maybe put more of that into footnotes and tightened up the book a little bit more. She spends a lot of time on James Angleton, but I do think there's a purpose to it, to show how one person within the intelligence agencies can build a fiefdom for himself, which then is not accountable to anyone and is able to pull off this caper with only minimal reference to other U.S. intelligence agencies, that the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. There's other context that you have to understand for the Liberty. I mentioned in my review on the James Scott book, The Vietnam War. That's one piece of context for the United States. A piece of context you have to understand for Israel is Operation Susanna. Operation Susanna was 11 Egyptian Jews, hopeful Zionists, people who wanted to come to Israel, who were led to believe by Mossad that they would be spirited away, or somehow Israel would take care of them if they would carry out these terror attacks. Somehow word leaks, they're all drawn up and they're put into jail, and Israel never comes for them. And this is a classic example of Israel doesn't even take care of its own people. They put them up to do this terrorist activity, again, to destabilize Nasser, to create problems in Arab countries. This is a favorite action of Mossad. And even when it's their own people, even when it's in Zionists, they don't take care of them. This is that classic thing. You would say, well, they're only in it for their own people. They don't even care about their own people. Operation Susanna sputtered out. 11 young terrorists, men and women, were sacrificed to world opinion, imprisoned, and served lengthy prison sentences. No match for the Egyptian services, they were pathetically and politically naive. One, Shmuel Azar, was incapable of lying and admitted that he was a full accomplice in everything his companions had done. We are Jews and Zionists, Azar said proudly, and we acted on behalf of the State of Israel. Although how terrorist acts of arson and bombings contributed to the welfare of the State of Israel, he could not say. Azar was one of 2 young Egyptian Jews who were executed in Cairo in 1955 in the wake of Susanna. 2 were acquitted for lack of evidence, 6 given prison terms from 7 years to life, and 2 condemned to death. So Operation Susanna is sitting here in the background for context. That gets us to Operation Cyanide, which is an operation many attribute to what happened with the USS Liberty. That USS Liberty was part of Operation Cyanide. And what was it? Remember, we had to get rid of Nasser. Nasser had to be eliminated, not because his regime constituted a danger for Israel, but because an alliance between the West and Nasser's prestigious leadership in the Third World and in the Middle East would inevitably lead to a peace agreement, which in turn would cause the Zionist state to be relativized as just one of the region's national societies, which would then mean it would have to live in peace with its neighbors. It wouldn't be the special only democracy in the Middle East, which obviously we know it isn't. Operation Cyanide was sacrificing liberty. The intent was for Israeli aircraft to attack the unarmed ship with unmarked aircraft, destroy its communication first strike, and then sink it with all hands. With no evidence other than the fact that it had been sunk in view of the shore, it would be assumed that Egyptian warplanes had done the deed. Obviously, the friendly Israelis would not attack a ship flying the American flag. But they didn't count on the bravery and the gallantry of the Liberty sailors who managed to get an SOS out under fire and sink their plans for being sunk. Speculation as to Israeli motivation varied. Some believe that as Israel expected that the complete destruction of the ship and killing of the personnel would leave the U.S. free to blame the UAR. UAR is United Arab Republic. At this time, Egypt and Syria were in a political union. The UAR. Were free to blame the UAR for the incident and bring the U.S. into the war on the side of Israel. Ironically, even though the Liberty had redacted, others felt Israeli forces wanted the ship and men out of the way, redacted. So these are coming from NSA dispatches. So now that we've talked about the why and some of the background for it, let's talk about some of the events on that day in which we now have additional insight from the intelligence community. During a second wave of strafings and firings, Super Mystère jets sent canisters of napalm that burned hot and clean onto the deck. When sailors arrived topside with hoses to put out the fires, the planes, swooping low, targeted the hoses and the firefighters and riddled the hoses with holes and the men with shrapnel. It was the war in Vietnam turned against American innocence. When sailors carried stretchers onto the deck to rescue the wounded, the planes took aim at the stretcher bearers. There were to be no survivors. Keep in mind, this is the behavior that Israel does to the Palestinians as well. They shoot at the press, they shoot at stretcher bearers, they shoot at journalists, they shoot at anybody, they shoot at unarmed civilians. And we see it carried out here. They're consistent. They don't care about anyone else other than their own aim. It is a war crime to fire on stretcher bearers, on medics, on firefighters. But as we know, Israel is not subject to international law. This is referring to Captain Richard Block, who was a duty watch captain with a security squadron. Unlike the USS Liberty, Block had a Hebrew translator in his unit, as well as an Arab linguist permanently on duty. And so they translated a deeply distressed pilot questioning his handler at ground control. "It's an American ship. It's an American ship. It's an American flag," he cried, assuming there must have been some mistake. Air Force intelligence also intercepted the ground control's reply. "Never mind. Hit it. You have your orders. Attack it. Follow orders." When the pilot continued to object, the controller became more vehement. "Do attack this ship," he said. Block sent a transcript of this conversation to President Lyndon Johnson as a critic. This is an acronym for a direct, high-level message. A message that went directly to the White House. So we have transcriptions of translations going out over the air in which we knew that the Israelis knew that it was a ship and they continued to fire. How did the men on the Liberty avoid sinking? This is Chief Engineer George Golden's actions. He acted swiftly and without undue speculation. He had given the order to flood the voids, the empty tanks along the bottom of the port and starboard sides. This was known as counterflooding. The tanks would be filled with seawater. He flooded the port side with seawater. He opened the ballast vents to take on seawater and create stability. They didn't have much free board left. With a full load, the ship sits lower in the water. Liberty did settle, went down more, giving them less footage above the surface of the sea. They sank a little lower, but they didn't have as much list, that means moving this way, and did not capsize. They survived. So thanks to the quick actions and the heroic actions of these men under fire, that's how Liberty survived. Not because of the incompetence of the Israelis. The Israelis competently strafed and bombed the ship and then shot a torpedo at it. Liberty manages to get out a distress call. What happens? At 3:50, a second convoy of rescue planes was launched, this time from both carriers. Admiral Geiss now sent a critic straight to the White House, informing McNamara that he was dispatching planes without any nuclear capability. 15 minutes later, McNamara was back on the line. "I told you to get those damned aircraft back," he snarled. "Call them back." After McNamara's second call, in clear violation of the code of no man being left behind on a field of battle, Admiral Geiss requested confirmation of the order. He required higher authority than a mere Secretary of Defense to abandon American sailors to certain deaths in violation of the Code of Military Justice. Dave Lewis calls McNamara Johnson's flunky. He didn't have to think, just obey. Admiral Geiss demurred. "These people are under attack," he said. These were men for whose lives he was responsible. He refused to obey McNamara. It was now that Lyndon Johnson grabbed the telephone and made his wishes known. "I don't give a damn if the ship sinks," Johnson said. "I will not embarrass my allies." So he revealed an hour before Israel admitted that it had been the aggressor, that he knew precisely who was responsible for the attack on Liberty. The military code of no man left behind had been rendered a mockery by this man, who had garnered a Silver Star fraudulently in another war, courtesy of General Douglas MacArthur as part of a political arrangement. Receiving such orders, Admiral Geiss had no choice but to obey. And in a twist of irony, something that you definitely wouldn't expect, Dr. Kiefer, who was the man who kept a lot of the men alive during that night just by stopping the bleeding and sewing them up, the Russians arrived to help before our own ships did. There are some Russian ships in the area and some offered assistance, and the Liberty said, no, we're going to have our own help. But if no one else had shown up, the Russians were there to help them. Something I don't have time to get into the review, but is also intriguing, is there was a ship not so far away from the Liberty, as well as a submarine, monitoring everything that was going on as part of this operation. Part of the cover-up, it's not anything that you're going to hear about unless you go through and look. And now we'll talk about cooking the books a little bit, because they've got to go back and start the cover-up. They hadn't planned on a cover-up because they had planned on the ship sinking. They had already launched planes to Cairo with nuclear weapons. They were going to depose Nasser and basically start World War III. The ship didn't sink, so they didn't have a pretext to attack Egypt. So those planes turned around, and then the cover-up begins. Admiral Martin did not act to include USS Liberty in his order previously issued to all other Sixth Fleet surface and air to stand off at least 100 miles from the coasts of belligerent nations. The Joint Chiefs supposedly sent a series of 5 messages, they claim. This was on June 7th. All were misrouted, lost, or delayed. What a coincidence! They call it one of the most incredible failures of communication in the history of the Department of Defense. One message ordered the ship to be moved 20 nautical miles from the UAR and 15 from Israel. The next gave the 100-mile figure. In retrospect, these messages appear to have been inserted into the record after the fact. Better that messages be rerouted than that a ship, wittingly on the part of those in command, have been placed in harm's way. So they have to be able to cover their tracks there and say, hey, we gave warnings, but somehow the messages didn't get through to them. Israeli denials that a flag had been visible were part of the cover-up. The flag was replaced twice, first by Russell David, who was the leading signalman. When that flag too was shot down by the Israelis, it was replaced by a flag hoisted by Frank Brown and Joe Meadors. There was never a time when the American flag was not extended in the breeze. This is another one of the Israeli lies. There was no flag, or the smoke covered it up. Where did the smoke come from? From your bombing runs. There was no wind. The weather report shows that there was wind. The lies aren't even good. Not even trying. Further evidence of U.S. government foreknowledge of the attack is that in the early morning hours of June the 8th, the U.S. nuclear force was at the ready on call. A unit of the U.S. Air Force, the 601 Direct Air Support Squadron, based in Germany, was placed on standby alert. The 744th Bomb Squadron, 4556 Strategic Air Wing at Beale Air Force Base, north of Sacramento, was also placed on alert. Air Force pilot Jim Nanjo came forward to author Peter Hunem and recounted that he was sent to take off in his nuclear-armed plane between 2 and 4 a.m. Pacific time. Nanjo had 2.5 minutes to dash to his plane, start the engines, and listen for an incoming message. Nanjo took his H-bomb, configured B-52, to the end of the runway and waited 4 hours for the coded message from Offutt Air Force Base. He would then proceed toward target where he would deliver nuclear weapons. The go code, which could be given only upon direct orders of the President of the United States, never arrived. Then Nanjo was ordered to stand down. Neither in Germany nor in Sacramento were the pilots ever briefed as to why they had been placed on alert. Bryce Lockwood subsequently learned that the entire nuclear force of the United States was on alert starting the morning of June the 8th. Why? Because something was going on. It just was foiled. And this is a reverse of what we saw with Vigilant Guardian and other war games that were happening on September 11th. I did a live stream on Loose Change, which talks about this a bit more. I'll put a link to that in the description as well as a card. I did that on the Stephen Hyder main channel. But they're doing war games to simulate something, and this takes planes away from the action where something bad is going to happen. In this particular case, they had a plane ready to go to participate in the action, but the action didn't go the way that they wanted. But all these clues here are picked up by people like Mellen, who are willing to be a detective. These people are willing to be detectives and search out the evidence and connect the dots. And that's how we're able to see all the things that happened. I apologize for my throat. I'm going to have to clear it a bit more during this time. There's also the accusation that the Israelis leveled at the Liberty that was traveling at a fast pace, and so it was suspicious, 28 knots. The problem is the Liberty was not capable of that speed. The highest speed the Liberty was capable of is 18 knots, and the Al-Jazeera, which is the Egyptian ship that the Israelis allegedly said they had confused the Liberty with, was only capable of 14 knots. How you go from 14 to 18 to 28, that would have to mean that the Israelis are incompetent. And one thing we know about the Israeli military, they're not incompetent. They may be murderous, they may be genocidal, but they're not incompetent. If the 30-knot ship could not have been Liberty, neither could it have been Al-Jazeera with a maximum speed of 14 knots, 4 less than Liberty. If the smoke that covered Liberty had made her difficult to identify was a result of the IDF attack, it could hardly be argued that the Israelis were trying to use it as an excuse that Liberty was throwing up a smokescreen to conceal her identity and was therefore an enemy ship. So we find an unsigned memo which gives us certain conclusions about what had happened. Fact: Israel advised U.S. of displeasure about the USS Liberty and its mission. Fact: Liberty alerted by being provided a copy of the transmittal. Fact: Amit pressed Dayan to sink the ship with hands and U.S. would blame Egypt because of the rerouted traffic. Fact: Israeli air and naval units ordered to attack the ship. Command knew it was U.S., but following Amit's direction of mighty force to blow it away, attacked 8 June. They're talking about Amit. This was an Israeli intelligence agent who was coordinating this attack, along with James Angleton on the U.S. side. Fact, Johnson, DOD, and state all informed on the 7th of pending attack. Fact, attack ship pressed on to Golan's capture and took the position that the U.S. knowingly sent the ship into hostile waters to collect to collect sensitive field commands that would have alerted their enemies to Israel's troop movements, timing, etc., and was a major threat that had to be removed because they felt the U.S. persons not sensitive to Israeli interests might knowingly share the data with Soviets, who in turn would share with their friends or Soviet intercept and reroute traffic to alert conflicting forces. So, the narrative from the Israeli side is despite the fact that the U.S. and Israel were allies, the U.S. would be listening in, they would be sharing this information, the Soviets would be monitoring U.S. traffic, would code break that, and then share that with the Egyptians. So plans within plans within plans, wheels within wheels within wheels. And so this was the Israeli narrative, which you'll hear put forth by Ben Shapiro and other people, that this was part of a malicious action on the Liberty's part. Actually, Ben Shapiro might say that he considers that a conspiracy theory. But in any case, there are Israel apologists who will say that the Liberty was on a mission and they needed to be shown who was boss. Cover-up continues, but cracks appearing. Captain Ward Boston, Admiral Starring, Moorer, and others speaking out. Fact, intelligence operations that were to have been used with Operation Cyanide are now beginning to surface. So this was an unsigned memo. Now, what happens after the attack? We have an admiral that comes on to talk to some of the wounded men. I'm Admiral Martin, he said, and I want you to know that we launched 4 planes with nuclear warheads off the USS America and 4 planes armed with conventional weapons off the Saratoga, only for the White House, Lyndon Johnson, to call the planes back. They were 7 minutes from target in Cairo when he was ordered to call them back. Wide-eyed, these 20-year-olds stared at him. Later, Mo Schaefer gave interviews to both CNN and to Nightline in which he told this story. This was in 1982 or 1983. He was interviewed for 25 minutes by CNN. I made 25 seconds on the air during which I was made to seem anti-Semitic, Schaefer told the author. Never seen that trick before. Friends called him and were indignant. Mo's interview with Ted Koppel for Nightline did not make the air. Not a word of Koppel's interview, in which Schaefer participated only reluctantly, was broadcast. This is an officer speaking to some of the wounded men. Let me tell you how this works, an ONI officer said. If you ever repeat what you told us, you will spend a few years in Leavenworth, which is a military prison in Kansas in the United States. Kavanaugh was 19 years old. He never spoke a word about what he thought about the attack on his ship. He became a math teacher. By 5:15 on June the 8th, McGonigal is the captain of the Liberty, had radioed his falsified account of the attack to the 6th Fleet commander, Admiral William Inman Martin. He referred to 6 strafing runs beginning at 2 p.m., although there had to have been many more than that. He mentioned the torpedo attack at 2:35, but neglected to mention that the torpedo boats had continued a machine gun attack on the ship for another 40 minutes. There is no reference to the torpedo boats having machine gunned the life rafts to ribbons. This message was the first detailed report to leave the ship. It came a few hours after the attack and was riddled with lies, and it was repeated by McGonigal when he later testified before the Naval Court of Inquiry. It was erroneous, minimized the incident, and in retrospect, seems to have been part of a preconceived plan. In substance, it was how the Pentagon would thereafter describe the incident, essentially verbatim, to the press. Now, I'm going to talk about McGonigal a little bit more in a moment, but what I want to stress is during the heat of battle or during anything scarring or traumatic, you may forget things. You may misplace things. You may misremember things. So we need to give grace to all of the Liberty survivors that they may have not remembered some details exactly correctly. But the idea that McGonigal intentionally falsified it as part of a plan would mean that he signed on for a suicide mission. And there is nothing that I've learned about McGonagall, either in James Scott's books or either of the documentaries, that one of which we would cover and one which we will cover, that made him sound like he was some hero willing to die for America's intelligence services in service of Israel. There's nothing about it. Now, could he have been railroaded after the fact, in which he said, listen, if you want to have a career in the Navy, you're going to say this is what happened? Yes. But the idea that he knew about it before the fact, that would have meant that they knew the attack was going to fail. And so I don't understand how Mellen is able to put forward this narrative that McGonagall knew ahead of time and then planned this ahead of time. It's very strange. It's one of the biggest holes in her book that is otherwise a good one, in which she feels the need to make sure that McGonagall is this treacherous person. A lot of the Liberty survivors do not take the position that she does on McGonagall, not because they don't think that he did not participate in the cover-up. They acknowledge that he did, but that he had some sort of evil intention before everything happened, I think, is a huge stretch. One of the survivors said, "This left us all in a conflicted state and very angry, like everything that had happened." He added, "It wasn't until the court of inquiry began that we realized what a massive cover-up had been put in place. Then a real sense of abandonment, anger, and frustration emerged. It is still inside of me today." On June the 12th, the order was broadcast, everyone on the ship muster on the forecastle on the aft deck. George Golden conducted a head count and was so rattled by the threatening and unpleasant atmosphere that he forgot to count himself. Glenn Oliphant remembered Isaac Kidd's threat as, "If you guys talk about this, I'll make sure you're in prison." They were to grant no interviews. They were to go ashore only in civilian clothes. They were not to mention the name of the ship. Just forget it ever happened, they were told. The CTs were told that everything was classified. "You have a crypto clearance. You cannot divulge what you saw or what you think, or you will be court-martialed, and you can be court-martialed and will be court-martialed. You still have time in the Navy. You would spend the rest of your time in jail. The officers have the right to shoot you." The tone was frantic, verging on hysterical. As well it might have been. What was at stake was that the U.S. had a role in collaborating with Israel to murder its own sailors, to be kept secret, a devil's bargain mandating that both the United States and Israel stay silent. And so through 2018 they have done, despite pressure from the surviving sailors. When shortly before his death, speaking at Arlington National Cemetery, McGonagall, who seems to have signed on to the cover-up in advance of the event, again, I think this is crazy, in advance of the event, so this event is going to fail, and I want you to help cover it up when it's going to fail. Very strange. Demanded the truth about the operation against the USS Liberty from the governments of the United States, now presided over by Bill Clinton, and Israel. He was ignored. He had long before rendered himself impeachable. He entrusted his papers to George Golden. "Those dirty bastards, they really did a number on us, George," McGonagall said. Then he wept. Pitying his old friend, choosing to protect McGonagall's reputation, Golden destroyed the captain's papers. On June the 15th, 1967, Secretary of State Dean Rusk told the NATO ambassadors meeting in Luxembourg that Israel's attack was deliberate. So there's a high-ranking U.S. official who said that. Many sailors faced a lifetime of surgeries. By 1980, Mo Schaefer had ribs removed to release pressure on his neck, 2 neck fusions, and 6 lower back fusions, all related to the attack. His ears were still ringing. His medical records had gone astray, and he was denied veterans' benefits. The Israelis offered him $500 in reparations. Larry Weaver endured a lifetime of pain. He emerged with a stainless steel left shoulder, 2 knee replacements, nerve damage to the right side of his body. Old age would be accompanied by the use of only his right thumb and index finger, with a square foot of mesh holding his abdomen together, and 60 pieces of shrapnel in his body. He had survived 31 major surgeries, yet on his DD-214 discharge form, the Navy made no mention of the USS Liberty. It took him 29 years to obtain benefits from the Veterans Administration. The betrayal is deep, and when you read it, you can't believe it. Adlai Stevenson III, both as a U.S. Senator and later became a supporter of the idea that the truth of what happened to Liberty should be investigated. When he ran for governor of Illinois in 1982, a strong effort by the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, if you'd like to learn more about the Israel lobby, I'll put a description to my review of John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt's book, as well as a card, resulted in his narrow defeat. He lost by 1/7%. A recount was denied by 1 vote. A judge named Seymour had admitted to a mutual friend, Bernard Peskin, that he voted as he did because of Israel. All it took for AIPAC to mobilize was Stevens' avowed intention to investigate the attack on Liberty as chairman of the Senate Subcommittee on Collection and Production. Can't have an investigation. And what happens when you serve Israel? Again, they are willing to abandon their own, as they did in Operation Susanna. Here in the footnotes from a book, Spies Like Us, Spy versus Spy Intrigue Between CIA and Israel, centered around the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv. Right, this is an article in the tablet in 2010. San Francisco lawyer Bartley Crum served as one of 6 Americans on President Truman's Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry into Palestine. Before his service ended, Crum had persuaded Truman to recognize the state of Israel. Truman was very early in this matter, and he reaped some honor for his courage. After Crum's death, his daughter, the writer Patricia Bosworth, was told, as a result of his devotion to Israel, to Zionism, and his incessant speechifying, often for no pay, streets were named in his honor throughout the Holy Land, and money was being raised for forests to be planted in the deserts, forests that would be named Bartley Kavanaugh Crum. Later, Bosworth, writing about her father, asked Israelis from Tel Aviv and Haifa if they knew of streets in their cities named Crum. They didn't. Nor were there forests named for her father. She asked the library in Jerusalem to please check. Back came a fax that read, "There is no record of any street or any forest in the state of Israel named Bartley Kavanaugh Crum." They even lie about the honors that they're going to give people who do support Israel. There is no honesty among these people. They are who they are, and there is documentation of it. Zionists, all of the records speak for who they are. If you'd like to support this channel, you can buy a copy of the book using the description below. That's one way you can support the channel. You can also do so by sending a one-time donation using PayPal or Buy Me a Coffee. There are links there below. Remember that any of the proceeds that come in through these various channels, they go towards the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, which helps children in Palestine get medical care who could not otherwise get it. And if you'd like to nominate a book for 2025, you can find them in my Amazon wish list. Buy a copy, send it to me, and I will review it. If they're on my wish list, it means they're things I'm already interested in talking about. Until next time, enjoy your reading.